In this lesson, we're going to talk about the lymph vessels and fluid. We get started, the first thing that we need to know are what are all the functions for the lymphatic system? Well, the lymphatic system is part of the immune system, and the purpose here is really to produce a couple of different cells that are key to that immune system. And these are T lymphocytes, B lymphocytes, and plasma cells. Well, the lymph system isn't the system where they're actually made. That's going to be in the bone marrow. But what happens is immature lymphocytes, like the T and the B lymphocytes and the plasma cells, are all made in the bone marrow, and then they're actually transported into the lymph system where they mature. And so that's really important to understand, that the mature lymphocytes are actually found in the lymphatic system. The other thing that the lymphatic system does is it houses these macrophages, which are the white blood cells that help to clean out the fluid. So these guys go to the sites of infection, and they're going to destroy different types of pathogens. And so they essentially clean all the fluid out. The last thing that the lymphatic system does is that it's going to return the fluids and the protein back to the blood, and we're going to talk about that here in a few minutes. So when we talk about the lymph system, the first thing we have to look at is the structure. So similar to the circulatory system, the lymph system is going to have different types of blood vessels. You also have to remember that the lymphatic system is a complementary system to the circulatory system. So if we look at the lymph capillaries, they're actually similar in size to blood capillaries, but they have these things called dead-end sacs. And if we look at the end, so let's say we were to draw a capillary bed. So one side is going to be, let's say the blood's going this way. Well, this side is going to be the oxygenated blood, and this one's going to be the deoxygenated blood, because you're going to have this capillary bed. So blood goes in, and then this side is going to be the blue side, and it goes that way. But what happens with lymphatic vessels is you don't have these capillary beds. You have something called these dead-end sacs. What a dead-end sac is it looks like the end of a tube, and they actually are porous. And what happens is there's a lot of high pressure right here in this arterial end. When I say arterial, the arterial end of the capillary, and this is going back to a venule. And what happens is the arterial side will actually seep out some of this fluid. So during the fluid exchange here, what happens is some of this fluid seeps out. Well, the fluid's going to return into the lymph system in these lymphatic capillaries. And the way that that really helps this is that they are actually intermingled with the blood capillaries. So if we look at this image here, you can see this capillary bed. So here you've got this arteriole, and this is under high pressure. So all of this fluid and the tissue cells is going to leak out into this extravascular space. And then the fluid, if you look at these arrows are delineating where that fluid goes back. So it's going to go back into these lymphatic capillaries. Once it goes into the lymphatic capillaries, it's going to go into something called lymph collecting vessels. And they're formed by these fusions of capillaries. And they're similar to the veins. They have thinner walls, but they contain valves. So if this is your lymph collecting vessel, that's your valve, that's your valve, that's your valve. And the fluid goes this way. And the reason the valves are there, we'll get into the why this happens. But the valves are there to keep fluid from going backward. And so the lymph has to move through these blood vessels. It can't just stay in the tissue because there is no pump. The circulatory system, the cardiovascular system in particular, has a pump, and that's the heart. Well, there's no heart in the lymphatic system. So what happens is the skeletal muscle has to contract to move the lymph through the vessels. So you have pressure from the skeletal muscle pushing on this vessel, and it propels the fluid forward. Then what happens is the fluid can't go, and these valves close down, so the fluid has to go forward. And then it goes forward into the next one, valve closes, and it keeps going forward. You have continuous skeletal muscle propelling it forward. At some point, all of these, all the lymphatic fluid and all the returning fluid is going to go back and it's going to pass through these lymph nodes. And what lymph nodes do is they act like, I'm going to call them toll booths, is essentially what they are. But basically it's spots where macrophages can come in and they can clean out any pathogens. It's where there's a lot of the immune activity. So just like we were talking about with the pump, we got to get fluid up back to the heart, because the heart's going to be the main focus that's going to keep the fluid going through the body. Well, because the lymphatic system doesn't have that heart or doesn't have the pump, what that has to get done some way. So what happens is all of the lymphatic fluid is going to be pushed up, and it's going to essentially enter into a vein. And what because that's the end goal, because we want to get the veins back into the cardiovascular system. But what happens is you have all this this fluid movement up, and it's going to enter into this main spot. There has to be a main kind of collecting area, and the first part that the lymph fluid is going to hit is called the cisterna chyli, and the cisterna chyli is actually at the space of L2. So if your sacrum sits right about in here, and then you've got 1, 2, so it's somewhere kind of in this area. And what happens is it receives lymph from these lower extremities, and then it's going to split into the right and the left collecting ducts, or the lymphatic ducts. And the right lymphatic duct is actually going to drain everything from the right upper side of the body, and the left lymphatic duct is going to drain everything from the left side of the body and both legs. Now, once it gets there, it has to find a spot to enter. So there's a clavicle right here, and there's a vein that is really important to the lymphatic system called the subclavian vein. Now, the right subclavian vein is going to get everything from the right lymphatic duct. The left subclavian vein is going to get everything from the thoracic ducts on the left side and from the legs. So what's the transport medium for all the lymphatic system? Well, it's going to be this lymphatic fluid, and the lymphatic fluid is nearly identical to blood plasma. It just has less protein. And what's really important about it is it actually the way it's formed and is circulated. So blood plasma is going to be filtered through exchange. So remember, we talked about the arterial here. So it's artery, or it's the arterial at the capillary bed. You have that high pressure, and then what happens is it gets sent tissue with the fluid. It's going to go into these cells. Well, it's got to get kicked back. Well, this is your lymph capillary, and this is your lymph vessel, and the fluid is inside here, and it's going that way. And so at some point, your valves are going to keep it going, but the blood plasma gets filtered through that fluid exchange, and this is called tissue fluid. And then it gets entered into these lymph capillaries here, and that's where it's going to go from the lymph capillaries all the way to the lymph collecting vessels. And you've got the lymphatic ducts, so this is a cisterna chyli. And then it's going to enter that subclavian vein on both right and left sides, and it's going to enter back into the heart. Okay, so let's recap. Well, what are the major functions of the lymphatic system? First off, they are the housing location for the mature T and B lymphocytes, and they're going to return that blood back to the circulatory system. The lymph capillaries, those are the ones that are really close to those to the blood capillaries, and that's the beginning of that return cycle to the circulatory system to get that lymph fluid back into the system. The lymphatic ducts, like the cisterna chyli, that's going to receive the lymph from the legs, and it's going to split into the right and the left sides. Those valves and contraction, that's how that lymph fluid gets moved back into the circulatory system. Remember, you've got the lymph vessels, those valves are going to keep the fluid moving that way and not that way. Plus, you've got the external pressure from the skeletal muscle. That's going to keep the fluid propelling forward as well. The lymph fluid, that's going to be your transport fluid for this system itself. It's got far less protein than blood plasma, but it's really important to the immune system. And that's our lesson for the lymphatic vessels and fluid. Make sure you check out all the resources attached to this lesson. Now go out and be your best selves today. And as always, happy nursing.